On the morning of August 18, 2025, something happened in West Africa that stunned the entire international community. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the leader of Burkina Faso, issued an order that the entire United States Embassy pack up and leave the country. This wasn't a symbolic gesture, not just the removal of one ambassador, but a complete expulsion of every American official operating in Ouagadougou. Within hours, the directive became public, and the world's most powerful flag, the Stars and Stripes, was told to come down from its post in the Sahel. For many, the announcement sounded like a political earthquake. Burkina Faso, one of the poorest countries in the world, had just taken direct aim at the wealthiest and most influential power on the planet. The timing was especially shocking. The U.S. had been funneling roughly $100 million annually into Burkina Faso's healthcare, education, and agriculture projects. By demanding a total expulsion, Traoré was risking access to vital medicine, food programs, and infrastructure support. And so, the question erupted immediately. Was this a bold act of sovereignty or an act of reckless self-destruction? Because this was not just about a diplomatic compound or about boxes being packed under the Sahel sun. It was about who gets to define Burkina Faso's future, and by extension, Africa's voice in global politics. In Washington, the embassy represented routine operations, intelligence gathering, aid coordination, military cooperation. In Ouagadougou, however, that same compound had become the most visible symbol of dependency, of foreign intrusion, and of reports written thousands of miles away that carried the power to define who was a hero and who was a criminal on African soil. Ask yourself this: if you were in Traoré's position, would you have taken this step? Would you risk hunger, school closures, and broken supply chains just to make a stand? In Washington, State Department officials were quick to label the move as diplomatic suicide. Analysts warned that aid flows could dry up overnight, leaving Burkina Faso facing shortages of grain, vaccines, and development funds. Yet, in the streets of Ouagadougou, the announcement was greeted with applause and chants that sovereignty was not for sale. Two completely opposite readings of the same event. To the Americans, a reckless gamble; to many Burkinabè, a long overdue act of dignity. If you believe this story deserves to be told from both sides, make sure to comment and share your view right now. But the real story doesn't end with the order itself. What pushed Traoré to such an extreme step? What exactly made him choose confrontation over compromise? To answer that, we have to go back to the moment that turned an ordinary diplomatic report into a spark of outrage powerful enough to burn through an entire relationship. And that is where the story truly begins. It all began with a single report from Washington. On paper, it looked like just another policy document, the kind that gets filed away in government archives every week. But, for Traoré, it landed like an insult written in bold letters. In this American assessment, Burkina Faso's armed forces were listed side by side with extremist groups operating in the Sahel. To an outsider, it might have seemed like routine language, a technical note on human rights. But for soldiers who had bled and died in places like Arbinda, Djibo, and Yaga, the comparison was nothing short of betrayal. Inside the presidential palace, Traoré slammed the pages onto the table, red marks from his pen slashing across entire paragraphs. His ministers watched as he read aloud the line that equated Burkina Faso's defenders with the very terrorists who burned villages and slaughtered children. "Do they not see?" he demanded. 2 million of our people displaced since 2016, 2,000 civilians killed just last year. And yet, they dare to place our army in the same breath as those murderers? For him, this wasn't about law, it was about narrative. If Washington could write the Burkinabè army as criminals, what story would remain for his people to inherit? Think about that for a moment. If your country's soldiers, your sons, brothers, and neighbors, were described in official U.S. reports as no different from Al-Qaeda, how would you react? Would you shrug it off as bureaucratic language, or would you feel the sting of arrogance? In the United States, officials brushed it off. A Pentagon spokesperson calmly stated that the findings were fact-based and standard procedure. But in Burkina Faso, the words were read on national television, carried into army barracks, and repeated in villages where families had buried their young men. The reactions were raw, emotional, and furious. If you can imagine yourself in their place, hit like or drop a comment, because this isn't just about Burkina Faso, it's about how power defines others with the stroke of a pen. And so, a technical report became the spark. What Washington considered routine paperwork was received in Ouagadougou as a dagger aimed straight at national dignity. The stage was set, the fury was boiling, and Traoré was no longer speaking in diplomatic tones. The next move he made would push the crisis to a point of no return. Inside government halls, the debate grew sharper. One minister nervously reminded Traoré that the United States was not just a political partner. It was the single largest bilateral donor to Burkina Faso. In 2024, alone, American programs provided nearly $115 million in support. That money kept clinics stocked with vaccines, delivered food aid to rural provinces, and funded teacher salaries in regions where schools were already under threat from jihadist violence. Walking away from Washington's partnership meant risking all of this overnight. Yet, Traoré's response was blunt. He told his cabinet that aid given without respect was nothing but a leash. "Aid without dignity is a chain," he repeated, echoing words that soon spread across state television. Better hunger in freedom than bread in humiliation. These were not empty lines. Since 2016, Burkina Faso had become one of the most aid-dependent nations in West Africa, with over 40% of its annual budget supported by foreign assistance. Every hospital built, every road paved, every school opened was tied to Western funding. But in Traoré's eyes, this dependency had come to look like a bargain where Burkinabè blood paid the real cost. Now, pause here. Imagine if your country's survival depended on foreign aid for medicine and classrooms. Would you call it partnership, or would you call it control? In Washington, the argument was simple. U.S. programs had saved lives and pulled thousands out of poverty. American officials framed aid as generosity, not humiliation. But in Ouagadougou, the narrative was flipped. If survival itself depended on outsiders, then dignity was already lost. Which side makes more sense to you? Drop a comment with your perspective, and if you agree this debate is bigger than one country, make sure to like and share this story. The standoff was no longer about money on balance sheets. It was about national psychology. On the streets of Ouagadougou, chants grew louder. Sovereignty is not for sale. In Kaya barracks, soldiers clenched their fists as broadcasts told them the world saw them as criminals. And in marketplaces, women weighed food prices against the promise of standing tall. The conflict had shifted. Not law, not aid, but dignity itself. And that question, whether dignity can be worth more than survival, was about to explode into the most dramatic scene yet. The lowering of the American flag. The moment the decree was broadcast, ordering every U.S. official to leave within 72 hours, the world's capital scrambled to respond. In Washington, the State Department held an emergency press briefing. Spokespeople described Traoré's move as diplomatic suicide, warning that more than $100 million in annual assistance would be suspended. Behind closed doors, officials debated whether to freeze all cooperation, including counterterrorism programs. One senior diplomat was quoted by Reuters saying, "If a country this dependent chooses isolation, then it must learn the cost of defiance." Paris was equally alarmed. France, still reeling from its military withdrawal from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso in 2023, feared a domino effect. Editorials in French newspapers painted Traoré as a gambler lighting a match in the Sahel's powder keg. A French defense official told Le Monde that if Ouagadougou broke ties completely with the West, the last rope connecting the Sahel to Europe will snap. For Paris, this was not only about aid, but about the erosion of influence across its former colonies. But Moscow saw an opening. On Russian state television, commentators hailed Traoré as a lion of sovereignty. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov went further, declaring, "This is not madness, it is emancipation. Africa is proving it will not bow to neo-colonial dictates." Russian envoys quickly offered military equipment and training, presenting themselves as allies with no lectures attached. It was a calculated move. Support Burkina Faso to gain leverage across the Sahel. Now step back and ask yourself, which of these responses feels genuine? The U.S. threatening to cut aid? France warning of disaster? Or Russia applauding with open arms? In America, mainstream coverage described the expulsion as a reckless step toward chaos. But for many Africans watching, Russia's applause, even if self-serving, felt like recognition. If you think the West's outrage is justified, let us know in the comments. If you think Russia is just exploiting the moment, share your perspective and subscribe for more balanced coverage. Meanwhile, Beijing chose silence. The Chinese Foreign Ministry issued no fiery statements, but within days, envoys quietly arrived in Ouagadougou with offers of grain shipments and technical assistance. Their message was understated but clear. We do not interfere, we only partner. Turkey, too, moved swiftly. In Ankara, officials declared they were ready to expand hospitals, schools, and relief missions across the Sahel, calling Burkina Faso a brother, a bridge, and a partner in faith. What the world saw in Traoré's act was filtered through its own lens. The United States saw risk, France saw collapse, Russia saw opportunity, China saw quiet advantage, and Turkey saw solidarity. And all of these competing narratives collided in Ouagadougou, where the embassy gates were already being shut. The question now was not just about one nation's dignity, but whether this defiance would trigger a regional shift, or leave Burkina Faso dangerously alone. While diplomats issued statements abroad, the real heartbeat of the story was in the streets of Ouagadougou. Crowds surged around the U.S. Embassy compound as soldiers set up cordons. When Marines lowered the stars and stripes for what could be the last time, chants erupted. Sovereignty is not for sale. Women ululated, students waved Burkinabè flags, and elders raised their hands in prayer. What should have been a diplomatic handover felt more like a funeral procession for decades of foreign dominance. On the walls of the capital, murals began to appear. One artist painted the American flag descending a pole while beside it, the green and red banner of the AES alliance rose skyward. Underneath, bold letters read, "Our story, our pen." Local radio stations replayed the image all day, framing it as a cultural turning point. Across the country, similar scenes unfolded, market sellers chanting, soldiers saluting, and displaced families saying they finally felt seen. Yet, underneath the noise, there were whispers of worry. In city markets, mothers asked how long food prices would stay stable if American shipments stopped. At clinics, doctors quietly counted their supplies of antibiotics, uncertain whether replacements would arrive in time. Now, consider this contrast. For many in the United States watching CNN or the New York Times, the image of flag lowering symbolized chaos, a country cutting itself off from the global system. Analysts warned of famine, shortages, and isolation. But for people in Ouagadougou, that same act symbolized pride, a sense that after decades of being lectured, their voices finally mattered. Which image feels more powerful to you, the fear of collapse or the pride of sovereignty? Comment below with your view, and if you want more people to see this side of the story, don't forget to like and share. Still, pride and symbolism could not erase practical concerns. The American embassy was not only a diplomatic building, It also coordinated aid distribution, security cooperation, and NGO support. Its sudden closure disrupted dozens of programs, from rural vaccination campaigns to literacy projects for displaced children. A veteran leaning on his crutch outside the embassy put it bluntly, "We bury not America, but arrogance itself." But the question lingered. Could symbolism feed the hungry or treat the sick? That tension was only growing stronger, and the next chapter of the crisis would expose it fully. The real test came not in the speeches or the murals, but in the daily struggles of ordinary Burkinabè. By the end of August 2025, the government estimated that over 6,000 classrooms had already been closed due to insecurity in rural provinces. Nearly 2.2 million people were internally displaced, many relying on aid programs funded directly or indirectly by American and European donors. Cutting ties with Washington meant cutting off pipelines that had long provided food, medicine, and school support to these vulnerable groups. In a camp outside Kaya, where tents stretched endlessly across the Sahel dust, children lined up for their daily ration of sorghum. Aid workers whispered to reporters that shipments were already slowing down. One doctor at a makeshift clinic explained that stocks of antibiotics might last 2, maybe 3 months without replenishment. For families who had fled jihadist violence, the embassy expulsion was not a headline. It was the risk of empty bowls and untreated fevers. And yet, when Captain Traoré visited one such camp, the reaction was not anger. A small boy grabbed his hand and asked, "Captain, will we have food?" Witnesses recalled Traoré kneeling down and replying softly, "Maybe less food today, but more freedom tomorrow, and freedom will feed your soul long after bread is gone." State television replayed the exchange endlessly, framing it as a proof of leadership by sacrifice. For many Burkinabè, it was a message that dignity was worth hunger, that liberty was worth the struggle of an empty stomach. From the American perspective, the response was brutally pragmatic. Senators in Washington asked whether it was ethical for a leader to risk famine in the name of sovereignty. One lawmaker argued on live television, "You can't eat dignity. Children can't survive on freedom slogans. This is reckless nationalism at the expense of human life." Editorials in the U.S. media warned that Burkina Faso could become a humanitarian disaster zone within months. Yet, in Ouagadougou, supporters countered, "We buried too many sons to kneel again. Let hunger test us. It will not break us." Here's the dilemma for you watching now. If you had to choose, would you prefer food under dependency or hunger under freedom? Which matters more to a nation's survival? Full stomachs or an unbroken spirit? If you think dignity should come first, type freedom in the comments. If you think survival must take priority, type food. And don't forget to share this video so that more voices can join this debate. But the clash did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. As the world watched the crisis unfold, regional leaders began to wonder whether Traoré's defiance could spread beyond his own country. The next chapter of this story would show that the embassy expulsion was not just a national gamble, it was threatening to become a regional chain reaction. The expulsion of the U.S. Embassy did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. Within weeks, neighboring governments began asking themselves a dangerous question. If Ouagadougou could defy Washington, why couldn't we? In Bamako, Mali's transitional authorities publicly praised the move, calling it a step toward true sovereignty. Officials announced plans to deepen the AES alliance, a regional pact created in 2023 linking Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso after French troops were forced out. In Niamey, Niger's generals declared that joint patrols across their borders would expand, promising to share intelligence and resources without Western oversight. By September 2025, the three countries had announced new military drills under the AES banner, signaling that Traoré's decision was not an isolated gamble but the embryo of a regional bloc. This alarmed Western capitals. In Paris, commentators warned that a Sahel domino effect could strip Europe of its last footholds in the region. French aid programs, already weakened, faced further rejection. In Washington, congressional hearings grilled Africa experts. If a small, aid-dependent country like Burkina Faso can dismiss us, what stops others from following? What happens if Senegal, Chad, or Guinea take the same path? The fear was no longer only about Burkina Faso's stability, but about the precedent it might set across the continent. Now, think about this. Is this the beginning of an African coalition rewriting its own story, or the start of a dangerous spiral away from international support? In the United States, think tanks like the Rand Corporation warned that the Sahel could become the next arena of a new Cold War, where Russia and China would step in as the West withdrew. But in Ouagadougou, the rhetoric was defiant. Isolation from what? From chains we never asked for? If you believe Africa should write its own destiny, hit like and comment New Africa. And if you worry this is a reckless gamble, share your concerns below and subscribe so more perspectives are heard. Turkey added another layer. In Ankara, officials announced an expansion of humanitarian programs, promising new hospitals and schools in the Sahel. Burkina Faso does not stand alone, a Turkish spokesperson declared. We are ready as a brother, a bridge, and a partner in faith. Meanwhile, Russia continued its praise campaign on state media, while China quietly deepened trade talks. Each foreign power was playing its own game, but Traoré insisted publicly, "Dignity is not for hire. We will not swap one master for another." The world was watching, neighbors were aligning, and foreign powers were circling. But for Burkina Faso itself, the bigger question remained unsolved. Could dignity keep the nation alive when hunger and shortages pressed closer each day? That dilemma was now reaching its final, most emotional stage. And so, after weeks of defiance, foreign reactions, and local sacrifice, the story comes back to the question we began with. Was this madness, or was it courage? On August 19, 2025, the gates of the U.S. Embassy in Ouagadougou shut for the final time. Convoys of black SUVs rolled out under heavy escort, carrying staff who had worked in Burkina Faso for years. For the first time in decades, the most powerful nation on earth no longer had a diplomatic foothold in this small West African state. In their place, the green and red flag of the AES alliance rose in city squares. Students chanted, "Africa Rise." Elders called it the burial of arrogance. Veterans said it was the birth of pride. But the celebration carried a shadow. By early September, reports from humanitarian agencies warned that without American food shipments, up to 600,000 people in rural provinces could face malnutrition within months. Health officials quietly admitted that vaccine campaigns for children had already slowed. International analysts pointed out that the U.S. had contributed nearly $13 million annually to Burkina Faso's malaria programs, a lifeline now at risk. The government in Ouagadougou dismissed these warnings, insisting that sovereignty was worth any cost. Yet the numbers were stark, and they raised the sharpest question of all: can dignity survive if stomachs go empty? From the American side, media outlets doubled down. The New York Times described Traoré's decision as a reckless gamble with lives. CNN panelists asked bluntly, "What good is freedom if your children starve?" In contrast, Russian and Turkish outlets painted him as a symbol of anti-colonial resistance. Chinese commentary stayed cautious but noted, strategic patience could open doors for Beijing. The clash of narratives turned Burkina Faso into a global stage, one where every headline carried a different truth. And now, the choice belongs to you watching this story. If you were standing in the square that day, would you have cheered the embassy's closure or worried about your family's next meal? Do you see Traoré as reckless or as the voice of a new Africa? Drop your answer in the comments right now. If you believe sovereignty is not for sale, type dignity. If you believe survival must come first, type, survival, and make sure to like, share, and subscribe so this debate does not fade into silence. Because whether you call it madness or courage, one fact is clear: the ink has changed hands. For decades, Africa's story was written in foreign capitals. On August 18, 2025, Burkina Faso tore up that script. And the question that will echo far beyond Ouagadougou is this: will history remember it as liberation or as the first step into dangerous isolation?